I'm Jasper Ludwig. I'm a lecturer here at the School of Architecture and Built Environment at the University of Newcastle. I have the privilege and the pleasure of moderating the session today. Before I go any further, I'd like to sort of kick the session off by acknowledging that I'm situated at the moment on unceded Awabakal country in a place that is known as Mulabinba or Newcastle. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Indigenous members of the audience today. I know that we're all really looking forward to hearing from Verena and Jack as part of the Visiting Architects and Experts program that our uni runs. We'll hear first from Verena, which is why she's at the top there, and then from Jack, assuming that he joins, and then we'll have time for a discussion. I'll give Verena a proper introduction in a minute, but just to sort of restate the context here, what we have at our school is a Visiting Architects and Experts program, and we use it as an opportunity to bring in interesting people from around the world, essentially to complement the teaching that we do, to extend it, and to give a variety of points of view for our students. There are a lot of events other than this one that are taking place this semester. So I really encourage students and non-students to take a look at our website. You can get there just by typing in what you see on the screen, UON Art Commons, into Google, and you'll get there. There's a lot happening and you're more than welcome to attend it all. But part of this wider program is a stream, as we call it, that's known as Radical Domesticities. And this year in particular, this stream is focused on financialization and architecture's relationship to debt. And I guess that's really another way of saying that we're interested in how architecture, as something that's always related to value that exists almost always on a market, we're interested in how those conditions of architecture can be explored differently, how they might be redefined, reframed, and how they might be worked with as conditions in a similar way to which architects work with light or material. What are the fundamental conditions of architecture in a financial sense that architects can start to think about? So far in this series, we've already heard from Professor Nicole Gurran from the University of Sydney. And she sketched out a really interesting history, I guess, of the privatization of housing in Australia. And today we have a really interesting opportunity to look far broader look far further afield as well, at a different set of questions being asked in different places, specifically in Europe today, around different ideas of ownership, different ways in which architecture can be configured around different ideas of ownership and different ways of living in the city. And the first contributor is, as I said, Verena von Beckerath. And Verena is a co-founder of a very interesting practice, Heide and von Beckerath, who are based in Berlin and who very frequently work with alternative models of ownership, and I think as well governance, alternative models of governance in their projects, in their urban housing projects. And maybe the most famous one, or the most well-known one, is the one I'm showing you here, the R50 co-housing project in Berlin. And I'm sure we'll hear at least a little bit about that today. Verena is also the chair of design and housing at the Bauhaus University Weimar and was visiting professor at Cornell University in New York. It's our absolute pleasure to have you here today, Verena, and I won't spend any more time taking time from you, and I'll hand over to you now and welcome you to our university.
Thank you, Jasper, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. It's 9 o'clock in the morning in Berlin. It's still summer. And I just found out that friends from Tokyo are participating. So I'm really happy to share this morning with you. And we are spread all over the world, but I think we have some topics in common. And I will, in my lecture, I will focus on 3 projects from my office. The first one is from 1999, so it's a very early project. We had just founded our office, Andrew Alberts, Tim Heide, and myself. So we just dropped out of school. And it's a very important project for us because I think it's small, but I think many of our ideas and approaches to housing, and especially to collective housing, have emerged from this little project. And the next one is R50 co-housing. I'm doing this because Jasper explicitly asked me to do it, and I think it's important and interesting. And I will skip the residential and studio building at the Farmer Flower Market. You can look it up on our website. I think it's also a very important project because it includes live and work, and also different kinds of financialization of the project. It's a little bit more complex, and if you present it, you have to go much more into the Berlin history and also the history of housing. And I think this could be another lecture. So I will skip that one, but I will present a new project in Fürth. This is a small city in the south of Germany, close to Nuremberg. It's not so well known, but they have become wealthy with a certain industry. It's a mirror industry in the late 19th century. Not a very good place to work for those who produce the mirrors, but they have, it's an interesting city, and there are people, a group of people who approached us in, I think, 2016 with the idea of a co-housing project, and they had a very different background to our clients in Berlin, but we found it really interesting. And I will tell you a little bit about this project. It's just before finalization. So it's not published yet. It's maybe a little bit more abstract, but I can present you a little bit how our architectural strategy with this kind of buildings is. So this will be the program. I will share my screen now. Wait. Yeah, is it fine? Full screen?
Yeah, that looks great. Yep.
Good. Yeah, this is a collage. It's one of our first Photoshop trials. So tryouts. I want to talk about this building that we, in our office, we called it at that time Wunschhaus number 1. And number 1 means that this project came out of a competition for a prefabricated house. So it was a magazine, a savings and loan association. So this is interesting in this context, and a construction firm. And they thought they could run a competition to find architects who would design prefabricated detached houses, so that every party, it would be interesting for every party, because the magazine called Stern, it's still existing, they had found out that most people in Germany really want to live in a detached house. And what is interesting is, I think things have changed since then, but since COVID-19, many people go back to this idea that maybe it's better that you live in your own house and you don't share too many spaces. So it's an interesting development, and we are working with our office, and also at Bauhaus Universität Weimar, I work a lot on how we can include not only affordability, but collectivity into the design of housing. And we look at this topic from many different perspectives. And so I think we have to be careful about this new development. But at the same time, we also think that we should maybe shift our interest a little bit from the city center to the periphery, because for many reasons, because it has become really expensive and there are no plots anymore in the city center, for example, of Berlin. So I think to rethink suburban conditions without proposing this kind of detached house would be a very challenging thing to work on in the future. So this house, it has been built, but only once, because of course the idea didn't succeed, to have architects as designers to have a better product. Yeah. But so we, our idea was that the house might integrate itself into different conditions. This was one of the ideas, but the most important idea was that we were questioning the house itself, because when we were invited, we were not really interested in taking part in the competition. The only thing was that the jury was quite interesting, and we thought we cannot just design a house. It's impossible. It's a very strange brief. No clients, just a house and just design. And this is, now we come directly into the topic. So what might a house be? So is a house always a master bedroom and a living and a nice kitchen and a family room and maybe small and dark rooms for the children to the bedside of the plot? No, we thought this is not something that we can imagine. We thought that we cannot imagine anything because we want to leave this decision to the people who live in the house. But of course, there were no people to live in the house because it was like working on a kind of product design. So we had the idea to propose a house that has two conditions, the corridor condition and the room condition. And then we worked on the relationship between the room and the corridor. And we imagined all kinds of views, for example, sleeping in the corridor, working in the room, taking a bath in the corridor, cooking in the corridor, or whatever you can imagine. We did a lot of floor plans, and this is the one without any proposition. You can see that it has two levels. There's a plot, 500 square meters or so. And the rooms have a connection to the corridor because, of course, the rooms need light. So it was interesting to think about how the light can come into the room. And now I would say, since I've been to Japan several times in the last years for another reason, I think it comes very close to the idea of the engada. So the Japanese house idea that there is a kind of inner condition and an outer condition. And yeah, so that was the layout. And we also did a collage because we thought that this idea of living in a corridor would need some explanation, maybe a narrative. So I still like this collage because it could be an urban dwelling, an urban apartment, but if you see the roof, you can see that it has something to do with a detached house. Yeah. And so this was our idea about the corridor. The openings between the rooms and the corridors have two doors so that you can decide whether it's a door or an opening. And this was the construction site. And what was interesting is we absolutely followed the approach to construction proposed by the construction firm. It's wooden walls, but we added these large windows, which were especially designed by us. And the construction firm couldn't produce them. So we found another firm to produce the windows, and they are really, really large. And you will see what happens, because when the house was built, we won a special prize, not the first one, not the second, not the third, but a special prize, because they didn't really understand the project, but they found it might be interesting. And in the end, first they didn't want to build it, but then they decided to build it. And what you can see here, the decision for the house was then to have the bathroom in the corridor, and you see these huge windows. And on the construction side, the people who worked on the house said, "What's this? I cannot believe this. Who would ever take a bath next to the window like this?" And you can also see the curtains. So our idea was that you see the flooring coming from the room. We proposed linoleum flooring. I don't know. Do you see my cursor? Can you see my cursor? So here, this is the connection to the room. And you can also see the curtain that we propose. So it's possible, this is a loop, so it's possible to protect the room or the bathroom from anything. And this is a sliding door, and here again is a sliding door. So you're able to walk around, but you're also able to separate, for example, the bathroom from the rest of the house. And there were some references we were interested in. For example, one was the kitchen at the Farnsworth house. We really liked this photograph because there's also a quote by the client. She didn't really understand, or she complained why she would have to cook and everyone could see her and could see the garbage in the kitchen and so on. I will not read it to you, but we were fascinated by this relationship between nature and the kitchen. And also, we were interested in this Gartenstadt house by Heinrich Tessenow, because it was quite similar to our brief, to have a plot and a house. And the brief came, for us, it came from a different time. So this is 1912, 1913. It's the idea of a house and a garden, and having potatoes in the garden because the people would work in a factory. So it's based on the disconnection between work and live. And of course, we have a different approach today. And I think we need to think about how to integrate work and live. So to talk about housing has also become a little bit difficult, because it might be housing and, or housing and the city, whatever. Many years later, we visited the house. It's in the periphery of Berlin. And I show you just two drawings by Heinrich Tessenow, because they are really, really beautiful. So you might study them if you want. And then we watched Mon Oncle by Jacques Tati, because the film is very much discussing the relationship between the family and the house, and especially the modern house, or the modernist house. I also recommend this film. And another project that we studied, even though I was not teaching in Weimar at that time, was the Haus am Horn. It's a project designed by the painter Georg Muche, but it was built with student workshops from the newly founded Bauhaus in Weimar before it moved to Dessau. And now I want to talk a little bit about the floor plan, because if you look at it, you see a kind of generous living area with connections to all kinds of room, like Dame, which is lady, or Kinder, which is children, or a Nische, which is maybe storage or so. Gastzimmer would be a guest room, a kitchen, and so on. So this is not the original floor plan. It changed before the house was built, but the approach remained the same. And it's really fascinating And in a way, our house referred to this one, but of course, it's a different interpretation of inner and outer space. This is a photograph from 2018, because now that I'm working in Weimar, I go there from time to time, especially there's a kind of habitude that if guests are coming to Weimar, that we walk through the park at the Ilm to visit the house. And here it is under reconstruction. And I found it extremely interesting how the house presents itself in January 2018. And I called my friend, now he's now not a partner in our office anymore, but a photographer. And I called him and said, you have to come, it looks amazing. And he came and took this beautiful photograph. Yeah, and then together with Andrew in 2011, we revisited the Wunschhaus #1, the only one. And it was very interesting how the house had changed and how the family who finally moved in had adapted to the house, because the house has also some, I don't know, it's open, but of course it also dictates some things or offers some things. For example, this is the children's room. I think this little boy was like maybe 10 or 12 at that time. And you immediately see that the flooring has been changed to a wooden flooring because they didn't like the linoleum. And you see how the light comes in from the window, and you see the bathroom in the back to the right, how it is connected. And we were especially intrigued by the idea that they put the desk for the boy into the corridor. So the children's room enlarged itself into the corridor because there's more light and more communication and so on. And another space that we really liked was the workshop by the housewife, because she had a little workshop to repair things or to work on, I think she was interested in manufacturing belts or something. And her workshop is also in the corridor. This is the corner of the house. And this is how the bathroom looked. It looked almost the same, but if you look a little bit more closely, you can see that they took away the curtains and they replaced the curtains by shutters in English, I think. Because they also had the problem with the large windows. And you can see the wooden floor, which I don't like, which I don't like in this house, because I think it's, yeah, I don't know. But they decided to have a house. Yeah, and this is how it looked in 2011. They had difficulties to have a living room, so they used the corridor for the sofa. You can see it here. And in the upper left corner, there's this little workshop. And you can also see the environment. It's interesting. It's very close to where I grew up, because it's in a suburb of Hamburg. And I think I grew up like 3 kilometers from there. It has nothing to do, of course, but it was very strange for me to work on a house in this area. Yeah, and so some of the images I'm presenting are from a publication that we did, because as this was a kind of, I think the whole project was a kind of publication project, and we produced a catalog that we printed ourselves with 100 copies at the Hochschule der Künste in Berlin. And then we had an exhibition in Hamburg and the next exhibition in Paris. So the house, yeah, had two presentations. And this is a double page from the catalog, and I'm reading something to you. Yeah, because we found this quote really interesting, and we put it in the catalog and also on our website. It's by Dietmar Steiner, who was the director of the Architekturzentrum Wien at that time, and he passed away 2 years ago. So he lasted to be the director, and in 1997, this is before the house was built, but the design was already there, or the proposal. He organized an exhibition which he called Standardhäuser, die Häuselbauer, because he was extremely interested in the phenomenon of detached single family houses. And he already questioned, like us, but from a curatist perspective, what this would mean to our society and living together, because also in Austria, most people wanted to live in a detached house. So he says this house is certainly the competition's most typologically innovative design. It is based on a concentrated core for living, which is surrounded by a second layer of service and utility rooms. 2 rooms on the ground floor, 2 rooms on the upper floor. The utility rooms and circulation areas are located on the outer layer. The interaction between the interior and the exterior becomes particularly important and challenges our living habits. This interesting, innovative concept for the interior of a family home is not visible on the outside and on its facade. With its relatively conventional appearance, the house undermines typical family life and is thus radically and subversively open to new forms of social living in the future. And this is exactly why I said in the beginning that the project has a certain meaning for us. Yeah. The second project is our 50 co-housing. I'm starting with a walk, one walk out of some walks we had with the building group to look at projects and to discuss certain projects in Berlin. And at that time, the project was planned and realized between 2010 and 13. At that time, they were in their, I would say, around 40. So some of them had small children, or they were just before having children, or they already had very small children who are now teenager. And or they didn't have children, but most of them were working, where they were artists or working in the creative sector. And this is, I think, important to understand how we all together could manage to work on this project and why it is so resilient during the times of occupancy until now. This is the house. It looks very urban here. It is, I would say, semi-urban because it is in the center of Berlin, but it's in an area of Berlin-Kreuzberg, which was very much destroyed in World War II. And the houses that are behind and to the left, especially to the left and behind the R50 co-housing project, are from an urban development from the 1950s with a lot of green, and it was half as dense as the Gründerzeit Blockbebauung that had been there before. This is the plot. The plot was very difficult to develop. And this is why the Senate of Berlin decided, together with the district of Kreuzberg, to announce a concept-based bidding for the plot. So the Baugruppen topic was already there. They had some experience. They found that Baugruppen have they are responsible for a good neighborhood. They have a good influence on the neighborhood, and they might be interested in doing this almost impossible development. The plot was not a plot for housing, but it was an infrastructure plot because in the 1970s it was part of a huge motorway that was planned but never realized. So it was left over from an infrastructure project. And yeah, so what you can see here, this is a block Bebauung from the 1990s when Berlin tried to re-establish the urban block. This is an open plan, as I said, from the 1960s, 50s and 60s. And this is buildings from the IBA, from the 1980s IBA, the International Building Exhibition. I will show you some images. This is how the 1980s social housing looks today. Again, a walk I had with Andrew Alberts, just to give you an idea how the reintroduction of social housing, but also of architects into the inner city in West Berlin at that time, how it looks now. It really looks suburban, it's very low. You will find situations like this. And there's also an interesting project quite close. This is by Hermann Herzberger, also part of the 1980s building exhibition, in a bad condition here, but I think it will be renovated soon or has already been renovated. I'm not so sure, but I think this image is really makes me a little bit sad to see how this self-building project. So Hermann Herzberger designed it, but then it was built together with the residents, and there was a lot of self-building the project. And next to this building is the flower market project that I talked about, that I skipped. You will not see anything. So again, this is the post-war housing blocks, only housing, how can I say, no ground floor, just housing. Yeah. And there you can see the R50 building from the back. And then I would like to explain you some ideas and features with this image, because I think it shows a lot of details, even though it is a kind of cutout. So you have the street here, and you have a ramp here because the entrance is lowered. It's in the souterrain, and this is for this reason we could put the ground floor a little bit higher. So this corner room is a community space. But here in the back of the building, there's already living and residential use. And then you see that there's an all-around balcony with no divisions between the apartments. You cannot really see where one apartment ends and the other one begins. And this is a structure that is in front of the house itself. You can see the wooden facade, and you can see that the windows are different. So behind this is the idea of a kind of modular approach to windows and openings. So there are fixed glazed elements, and there are elements that you can open. There are elements that are just one door or two doors, and there's also a folding element. And this was a collection of 60 centimeter, so it's based on a 60 centimeter modular grid, and every element is based on 60 or 120 or 150 and so on. Yeah, and you see the bicycles here on the ramp, and you also see, and I think this is really important, there are no fences. So the house has no fence, no fence to the street, and no fence to the houses in the back. Yeah, so the question would be, what is different? And I think there are some features that are different, and individual representation is very low and collective representation is on a very high level. But of course, there are individual expressions, but they are part of a larger idea of a house where people live together. So this is important. These are the floor plans. So you can see the souterrain with the ramp and storage and the workshop and the laundry and so on. And you can also see that the regular floor plans are different. The core is the staircase is always at the same place, of course, and the elevator as well. And the course for installation, HTVs, also at the same situation. But then the floor plans themselves, they change. And this is because we have worked together with the residents on the floor plans. So they were able to decide about the size of rooms, the number of rooms, and the accessibility of rooms, and the very important, the relationship between rooms. And you can study it when you have time, but I would like to explain one thing. Even though the floor plans, it's always 3 apartments per level, and in one case it's 4. But what you can see is that very often you have a connection here. So here are the all-around balconies, which are shared. But here there's an inner connection between the rooms, and I can show it to you on the photographs here as well. And this makes the rotating system of the balcony also to be part of the apartments themselves. This is the ground floor. This is the double height community space. And here you can see it's a very simple volume, but it had some difficulties to be implemented into the ground. This is about Feuerwehr is what in English? Fire
brigade.
Yeah, fire brigade. Yes, this is for access for fire brigades and so on. Yeah, and now I want to show you some images. This one is important because you can see how simple the house is built. Of course, it is designed with a refined approach to details. And even though the railing of the stair is just a line, it's designed and not a product. Yeah. So the house is somehow, there is a shift from adding products to the design. Instead of that, we worked with prefabricated elements. Like you can see that the stair itself is a prefabricated element, but then it is implemented into a space. You can see that there's no plaster, so it's a raw brick wall. And you can see that the concrete has a very low refinement. So it's not Sichtbeton. It's not the kind of concrete that you would have to have a finishing. Yeah. And if you look at the apartments, you will find some details. So you have the brick wall in the apartments, and you have the concrete ceiling here. This is also a prefabricated element. It's called Filigrandecken in Deutsch. I don't know the English expression, but you have elements, and then you have also concrete to connect them and to, but it's based on elements. Then you have the wooden facade that is also wood to the interior, and you have a kind of concrete flooring. This is not the construction concrete, but it's, I don't know the word in English, Estrich. It's another layer of cement, that is disconnected from the ceiling. But usually you would have a flooring like wood or linoleum or carpet or whatever. So we left it like this. There is a finishing on it so that you can clean it. as mud as possible. Yeah, and this is a corner room. And this is the apartment with the triangle bedroom that you might have spotted. And this is the situation that I explained before, where the balcony, which is 90 centimeters in depth, where this comes together. And I think it's really beautiful how the layout of the apartment is connected with the balcony. It's the opposite of having a living room and then a balcony, yeah, to expose yourself, to express your, I don't know what. So it's more like, yeah, like I said, being part of a larger project. And this is a balcony itself, so it would not be possible to have a table and 4 chairs, but it is possible to have a rabbit running around or to read a book. Yeah, this might be interesting for you, for the students. So there's the primary construction here, the concrete grid, and this is the wooden facade made of closed elements and the windows. And then you have the balcony, and then you have the railing. And what is interesting is that the balcony can also be used to maintain the wooden facade, because it has to be painted from time to time, because wood needs more maintenance than other materials. So it's also a kind of, so yeah, this is the street view. And the community space with an artwork by Ruth Cameron, and a kitchen that came in, because this we gave it in a quite raw condition to the residents. Yeah, and what is interesting is how the cooperation between the architects, that is Heide von Beckerath, and we cooperated with Eva and Jesko Fezer, second office. And behind Eva and Jesko Fezer are 3 families who also moved in, who are part of the building group. And we developed a quite intensive participation process. So there were different, or I would say a continuous participation of the future residents into the design of the building. Yeah, and this was the day of the opening. And I like this photograph very much, because every apartment was open, and sometimes you didn't know if you were in a house or in an apartment. And the photograph also represents this idea that it might be one big family instead of single individuals or single groups of families. The project was published quite early, already in 2011. And there was an event featured by Arc Plus, which is an important architecture magazine, which has a very important role in the architectural discourse. You might know it. And there was this event and also a publication that came with one issue of Arc Plus. And I will go through it. Here you can see how the plot was, what it was before, how it was meant to be, a kind of ramp for this kind of motorway. And yeah, and this is this double page shows how we worked with the future residents. First of all, they presented how they live now or how they lived before, how different rooms are connected, and then which connections of rooms they needed. And so this is these diagrams come from. And then we discussed in large what the common standards of the building would be. So what would be standard, what would be individualized. And the idea was to have as many common standards as possible, because it was really about having an affordable building, not only a collective building, but an affordable building. And it came out that it was really low cost in the end. The residents own their apartments, but this was not the idea in the beginning. They really wanted to be a cooperative where the building is owned by the cooperative and the residents pay rent, but it was not possible for some reason, and came out that it was easier and also more sustainable for the group to have this Baugruppe. So in the end, every family owns the apartment where they live in. They can sell it if they want, but they have worked on a kind of manifesto how they, how can I say it? How they treat the building, how they maintain the building, and what the responsibilities are in a society where private ownership is the highest good. Yeah. These diagrams show how we discussed shared spaces, what kind of shared spaces they wanted to have. So in the beginning, from the beginning of the design process, we proposed a shared space on every level, so that 3 apartments or 3 families would share a 20 square meter room as a library or guest room and so on. And when we went on with the process, the group decided to have one bigger community space that can be divided into 2 because it is double height. It has 4 doors, so it can be approached from the street when there's a public event, or from the house itself, or from some other locations around the house. Yeah, and then when the project was finished, it was discussed interestingly in many different environments. Here, for example, is a publication in the magazine Texte zur Kunst, which is an art magazine. And there was a discussion between 4 residents about the house and how they live in the house and how it is related to their role as artists and to their practice, even though it is only housing. But many of them later said we would have loved to have the studio space in the house. And this also gave us the idea to work on projects from then on that combine housing with studio space and some other activities. So this was moderated or initiated by Hila Pelek, who's a curator, and there's a new series of photographs that came with this publication in 2015. And it's also interesting how different photographers develop a different view. And here in 2015, it was already occupied by the residents, and some things had changed. And you see that they are much more lively than the first series of photographs. Yeah. And this is the community space and the roof. And this is another publication where Jessica Bridger compared, there are 50 co-housing to a commune, or she asks for the differences. And I skipped this. And then we were invited for an exhibition in Prague, in Czech Republic, where a very young generation of people around 30 was discussing how they could influence their lives and what kind of housing they could have for themselves and their friends and families, because in Prague there are only investors investing in new developments, and they were asking themselves if the Baugruppen model that they had found in Berlin, if they could import it to Prague. And there were a gallery space with models, but also a lot of events and lectures and workshops, which was interesting. I went there several times, and here you can see that they were like boxes, and they had certain plans and cards where they could put them on the table and discuss, and they would relate to the various. I think there were 5 or 6 projects from Berlin exhibited, and a beautiful catalog. And then Jasper, I told you about it. I will show it again. Then there was a shooting for a series called Homeland in the mid 2010. It was, I think it was also around 15, 16 or so on. And so you can see how it's about terrorism. So there's a professor living in the house, and this is the young student, and they are working on a bomb. And when the police is coming, he is fleeing, he's escaping the apartment via the balcony. And you could see the brick wall, and the actress Nina Hoss with the fragmented ceiling in the back, in her background. And the last series is by Steffen Jagenfeld, I think, or Jagenburg, another photographer, and these images are part of a publication, a recent publication in a Melbourne-based magazine, and it's a portrait about the artist Rose Buchanan, who lives from New Zealand, who lives here with her family. I show you these photographs, and I will read a few quotes from her interview because I think it's interesting to think about how the residents and future homeowners are talking about their lives and the house. She says, we were making collective decisions about things like bathroom tiles, seemingly small details, which actually revealed life priorities and vulnerabilities, limits and desires. We were simultaneously trying to figure out what each decision meant as a family or individually and as a collective in a very public and open way. It didn't come naturally for everyone. So there was a learning process because no one had done something like this before. She also says people had different understandings of what the primary purpose of particular zones in the building were. How collective do those shared spaces need to be? Now, the ecosystem's established and running smoothly. There are still moments where we have to make decisions together, but we understand how to do this constructively. And the last one is, which is also interesting. I'm not in my neighbor's face all the time, but I have never felt totally alone or isolated. This is, the question is how during COVID-19, it was last summer, how the building weathered the lockdown. She says, I'm not in my neighbor's face all the time, but I have never felt totally alone or isolated. The building has become a space of empathy. Everyone is keeping safe, but also connecting. I hope people can become open to this kind of porous community. I really like the expression porous community because it's very open and not, it also questions our role as architects and designers a lot. Yes, an anonymous apartment block is challenging in comparison to the detached house. But if it has shared zones and there's the capacity for it to be intergenerational, it could be so positive. No. Okay. Third project. This is a quite large project, as I said, in Fürth, and it has some similarities because it is also part of a series of my office working with building groups. But this is more complex for some reasons. First of all, it is a reuse of a former industrial site. This is why, Jasman, I have chosen this project. I think you, the students, are working on a similar brief. The plot is between two streets, and one of the ideas was to connect the two streets and to have a public pathway through the building, which we realized. And there was a group, they approached us in 2016. They liked our Berlin projects. They found our approach interesting, but they already had architects and they wanted to resign with them, which is not a very good starting point because we were a little bit afraid that they would do the same thing with us if we start working together. So we thought that in the beginning we should be really transparent and honest and clear about what our role would be and what we want to do. That it's not that we are like serving them to become a nice Baugruppen project, but there's also an experience and expertise from our side that we want to implement. And they already also had to follow a little bit our structure. They didn't like that. I said in one of the first meetings, I said that there might be a certain authority besides the idea that we are working on a participatory process. It was difficult to say, and it was also difficult to discuss, but in the end, they trusted us, and that is how we became commissioned. We started with workshops to get to know each other and to focus on certain topics. And yeah, so Fürth, as I said, became quite wealthy in the very late 19th century. This is a building from the Gründerzeit. And what is interesting is that they have a certain stone in this area and they carve all the decoration from the stone. It's a kind of limestone, I think. And this is where the wealth came from. It's large mirror industries. And our plot was a former mirror industry. So it was, the ground was poisoned from, what is quecksilver in English? Is it quicksilver? No. Yeah, quicksilver. Okay. But we were able to have one building, to keep one building, a former forge, and this is what you find besides the industrial buildings and the Gründerzeit buildings. So there's a range of strange things. So it's half urban, half periphery. The upper road, so there are 4 meters between the upper road and the lower road. Here you can see it. The upper road, which is to the left, it's in the south, is quite urban. And the other road is very suburban. So the building and the plot really connects these two worlds. And you can see that there are 2 buildings that become like head buildings to the streets. And there is a way through here, and there's an open public stair. And there are different possibilities to walk through, and there's a public alley and different ways to enter the project and to leave it again. This is the next level. Here's a garden. This is the forge. And here's the entrance from this side. And before there was the lower plan was the garage. And then the main approach to the apartments is that it is a gallery building that connects the two Kopfbauten, head buildings. And they were not convinced to have a Laubengang, because a Laubengang, a gallery, reminded them to mass housing from the 1960s and 70s, and they thought that this is really not what they want. They wanted to be, it should be intergenerational, there should be migrants should be integrated in special apartments that would be funded by the city. The whole building was open for all social backgrounds and so on. So they had a huge idea about this new community. It is a mixture between a cooperative and a Baugruppe. So some apartments are owned, others are rented. So it's a mix of different finance systems, funding, private money, cooperative money, and so on. And we convinced them in the end with the idea that there's a gallery and that it would shift from east to west, and that the house was mirroring itself, you will see. And we convinced them also because we said the galleries we know from mass housing from the 1960s and 70s, they are in a way, they repeat the idea of the detached house. They have the kitchen and the toilet to the Laubengang and the living room to the southern side with the balcony. But if we have the gallery on the east and the west, it could be very transparent. You can choose if you want to sleep to the gallery or cook to the gallery or live to the opposite side or work to the opposite side. So you can see that there's some ideas from the Wunschhaus #1 that accompany us through our work. And they became interested, and in the end, they all wanted to have apartments at the gallery. So they really changed their mind during the process of there's a concrete structure and a wooden facade. So it's based on wood and on a wood construction. And here you can see a very, very important approach to the gallery on one hand, but also to this open alley. The gallery has a kind of T column, and this interestingly divides the gallery into a part where people walk and a part that is more or less related to the apartment behind. This is the community space, they call it Spiegelsaal. It's a quite generous room, like a Wintergarten, which you can open, and then the public alley goes through this community space. And this is the construction. You can see a refined concrete construction, and this is this special T piece. And what's interesting is that it is not based on columns and not based on walls, but based on frames. And the frames allow to have larger apartments that go from one section to the other one. You will see it later. We were asked for so many different sizes of apartments, and in relation to the Bavarian funding system, that we proposed a kind of modular approach to the idea how the apartments are made and layouted. And we proposed a small apartment of 27 square meters as the core model. And then they said, why? Because nobody wants to live in the 27 square meter apartment. but this was so we minimized the core section, yeah. And then you can have 2 of them, or 3 of them, or 4 of them. And you can also intertwine them to have apartment sizes that are in between one and the other. And you can have them on 2 levels. And you can have 2 sections and 1 section on 2 levels, and so on and so on. So it's not very important to go into detail, but what is maybe important is there's the gallery, and there's a small balcony and a large window. So if the gallery is on the left side, the window and or the balcony is on the right side. So it goes like this. And then you have, of course, a core that is in the right place to organize the apartment differently. So bathroom, kitchen, here's a small room to the gallery, and another room here. And so we came up with a series of variations, but of course it's not so easy to, in the end, to define how it really works. And yeah, these are early visualizations to explain to them how this would work. Here you can see a bench. So wait. And the building is not very deep, so this is a possible image that you have a kind of connection between one side and the other. And the window as one possible opening to the side opposite to the gallery. Yeah, and this was the construction. It really looked like an industrial building and not like a housing project because of these frames. The gallery. You know, I want to go briefly through the floor plans because it's quite complex to understand. Now, north is here, south is here. So this is the entrance to the parking garage. We had to do this because in this area, you have to show that there's 1 car for 1 apartment. You have to build it. In Berlin, you don't have to do it anymore. And in some cities, yes, in others, no. And here we were able to reduce the number of parking lots because they decided for a sharing system, but they had to, I think it's maybe 0.7 instead of 1, something like this, a reduction. Yeah, and the next floor plan was the garage. Here you have already, you can walk in. Here you have the basement of the upper part. And here you have the entrance from the upper part. Here you are already on the 2nd floor. First floor, I think. This is ground floor, this is 1st floor. Here's the garden with the reused furniture. And this is one of the regular floor plans, and another one, and the rooftop, which is used for gardening and the sections. Yeah, and here's some photographs from the construction site just to give you an idea of the size of the project. This is the future garden. It doesn't look like this, but it will be a garden. And here are the first photographs of the apartments. Of course, people hadn't moved in at that time. These are 2 months old, I think. And you can see the visible concrete construction. these are wooden windows, and they are painted in a kind of grayish green. Most of them opted for linoleum. Some opted for wood. Yeah, thank you. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Verena. That was caught me by surprise. Thanks, thanks very much for such a generous movement through very different scales, and perhaps that's
and a long time period.
Yes, yeah, and a long time period. Yeah, that's true.
20 years.
20 years. Yeah. Yes. I think what's probably best is if we just roll straight into Jack's presentation and then come back for a joint set of questions, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, great. If you don't mind then just quickly unsharing your screen so that I can reshare mine, just so that I have some decoration while I speak. And Jack is here. So thanks again, Verena. I think what I hope to be able to chat about at the end is, I suppose, the ways in which working across those scales and thinking about questions around financing are perhaps related to or different from what I believe Jack is about to speak about. Are you there, Jack?
I am here. Hi.
Hello. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
I'll just quickly introduce you, Jack, and then I'll let you get started. And for a lot of you, Jack will be known, given that he contributed to our program last year. But for those of you who don't know Jack, apparently I just unshared my screen. Hopefully you can still see it. But Jack's director of the Real Foundation, which is something that I often speak about in my lecture materials for all the students who are here. And I'm sure you're familiar with his work from there. But he's also editor-in-chief of Real Review, a really fascinating publication that's difficult to get your hands on in Australia, but terrific when you can. And teaches domestic design at the Architectural Association in London, and was also curator of the British Pavilion at the 2016 Venice Biennale with a show called Home Economics that students will also know a lot about. But as of relatively recently, as far as I understand, Jack is also co-founder of something called Real Homes, which is a project that I've heard or I've read Jack talk about as an ethical real estate project. And I think that is especially interesting, not least of all because it contains the word ethics. So I think that we're going to hear a little bit about that today. It's terrific that you can be here, Jack, once again. And I'll hand over to you for the presentation, and then we'll round off with some discussion at the end. Keep questions coming in the chat if you have them, everyone, and we'll make sure we get across them all. I'll stop sharing, Jack, and let you.
Thank you.
Take over.
Thank you so much. I won't presume that you know much about my work, but I'm actually, so I'll give just a very brief additional kind of biography. I'm trained as an architect. I'm a registered architect, and the work that I've been doing for the last 10 years has been split across two fields. Half of it has been, I also have a degree in macroeconomics and philosophy. And the work I've been doing for the last 10 years broadly falls into two categories. Cultural work, which involves some of the things with Real Foundation that were just mentioned, publications, exhibitions, kind of consultancy work for a lot of different companies. And then the other side falls into work in the sphere of finance, and particularly kind of project finance and Most of the types of projects I like the best are those which look at both halves simultaneously. So, for example, we're very interested in designing or contributing to, let's say, non-neoliberal or non-Anglo models of capitalist housing. And I'll definitely get into more about that in a minute. Next month, we're publishing a translation of a book by two German architects, a German architect and a German sociologist, Oswald Matthias Ungers and Lieselotte Ungers. The book in German is called Kommunen in der Neuen Welt, and its English title is Utopian Communes in the New World, 1740 to 1972. This is a very short book, which I like very much, but I think particularly in light of the work that we've seen today, of course, I'm fascinated by the diversity of models that exist in Europe, particularly the Baugruppe and the cooperatives of different kinds, particularly in the Germanic world. So I'm thinking of Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. These are really remarkable that they don't exist in the Anglophonic world in any way a problem. And if we go further across to America, projects like we saw presented today, I think often get described by Americans as kind of radical communism, whereas for us as Europeans, I think we see them as quite a normal part of providing good quality housing for the general population. And in that sense, Real Homes is a project which I suppose I've been working on for 10 years, but really in earnest in the last 18 months. And it is an attempt to create a housing company. As an English architect, no one would ever commission you to do this. I am going to say more about it, but in a way, I've got a bit of a problem here, which I'll come to. Basically, the concept behind Real Homes is that we are redefining ownership. We are creating and we're building on existing environmental standards and really pushing those to an extreme level. Our alternative ownership is, in essence, a mechanism which starts out using existing market finance, but then over time turns into a cooperative model and a large-scale cooperative model. And it's also run with a kind of governance structure, much like Real Foundation, which promotes inclusivity and equalities of many kinds, racial, gender, wealth, class, and so on. Because we really understand that housing, particularly in Anglo countries, is really and actually, however, I have some. So I was going to show you like all these amazing pictures and stuff, and all the floor plans, and walk you through the financial model and the operations and so on. But this has to be cancelled actually, because I was speaking with the other executives of Real Homes, and I'm not actually allowed to speak about these things yet. So I'm hoping that I might be able to come back after next March and present this work to you. And this has put me in a bit of a difficult situation, because I had put together quite a good lecture, but you'll just have to imagine what it was. Instead, the lecture is now called, if I can get this screen to display. Oh, and now it's called Life Without Debt. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to talk around some of the abstract concepts behind Real Homes rather than directly to Real Homes itself. And maybe we can talk a bit more about it in the questions. I'm sorry for being so vague, but of course, this phrase "life without debt," which was the title of the first book, or subtitle of the first book that I produced in 2014, comes from a quote which was in that book by an Italian who said that life without debt is an asset in itself. And certainly, I'm very interested in this. The work that we do broadly follows this dictum: form follows finance, which means that as architects, we're asked all the time to think about material conditions, environmental conditions, historical conditions, planning, policy, building regulations, structure, energy use, all sorts of different patterns of life, concepts of normality, structures of the family, demographics, geographics, etc., and so on and so on and so on. But we are almost never asked to apply our design skills to financial structures or to ownership structures or corporate structures. But that's actually where most of the decisions are made before the architect arrives. I mean, for the majority of architects who are working on conventional developer-led projects, they're receiving a budget and they're receiving a brief with the number of units and even the size of the units before they begin. So you have very little ability to make an argument for an alternative. And what does that really mean, form follows finance? Well, all architecture and all construction, all development, let's say, is a product of three factors: time, space, and money. They're all interrelated with each other. And what I want to do is talk about these three concepts, the history of these three concepts, so that we can be clear about the assumptions that underpin, you could call it, well, it's called many things. You could call it neoliberalism. I prefer late capitalism, but we're really talking about financialized capitalism as it existed certainly in Britain and America, and a number of other. It's a predominantly Anglo export. You still see very strong models of social democracy in other parts of Europe, and of course outside of Europe, there's an even broader proliferation of kind of patchwork of different capitalist and non-capitalist models. But in essence, I'm really thinking specifically of the UK and the US after, let's say, 1974. And this model of capitalism has become highly destructive. I think it's led to the phrase that Jasper mentioned, or as the title, which is the financialization of everyday life. So in essence, I want to just touch on the preconceptions that we have today about time, space, and money, and how they produce particular forms of architecture. In terms of time, we probably have to go back to about the 3rd century, sometime in the 300s. And before then, the experience of time was radically different from how it is today. For example, the ancient Greeks had no concept of progress. They didn't think that things ever got better or worse. They just were in a constant cycle between periods of economics and periods of politics. Periods of economics being, of course, the period in which the city was governed by the ekos, which is the clan, the private family, and politics, which is the time when the city was governed by the polis, which is to say the citizens. But they didn't think that, they thought that this kind of tyranny and democracy were eternal. There was no change in civilization. So no progress. You have, of course, agricultural time, which operates according to a natural rhythm. And then, of course, you have certain kind of concepts of Roman military time. But again, they're not universal. They're tied to the seasons. And in around about the late 300s, early 400s, there were a lot of monks and religious figures who pointed out that Jesus said he was coming back, but Jesus had not come back. So why had Jesus not come back? And this was of great concern to them. And some of them said, maybe it's because we're not living right. In which case there then became a question about how do we live right? And what came out of that was the idea of productivity, that in fact, maybe the problem was that they were only serving God while they were in churches. But actually, maybe everything was an act of God. Maybe it was important how you make a bed, or how you plow a field, or how you sit when you read. And this concept of perpetual liturgy led to an idea of productivity through the fact that they were like, well, obviously, the more we do in service of God, the better the world will be, the sooner Jesus will come back. But how do we maximize our acts in the service of God? So they started to try and find ways to measure this. They knew that perhaps yesterday they had plowed one field and today they had plowed half a field. But they had no real way to measure productivity. This led to the introduction first of water clocks and then of increasingly complex mechanisms, which regulated the day and created a universal time. Before that, there were 24 hours in the day, according to the Roman clock, but they varied through the seasons. So during the summer, an hour in Britain would be about 70 minutes, and during the winter, an hour would be about 38 minutes. So they realized they needed to regulate this, and that's why they used water clocks. And of course, they became obsessed by the clock, obsessed by measuring and by regulating their day. Then, after a little while, the monasteries decided that everyone should now be doing this. So, of course, they put the clocks on all the towers in all the towns. That's why churches all have clocks on them. And then during the 1500s, King Henry VIII decided to destroy all the monasteries for reasons I can't get into right now. And all of the monks had to leave, and they didn't know what to do. They didn't know any other life except this kind of maximizing their activities in the service of God. And so they couldn't form monasteries, that was banned. So they formed what they called companies, which were groups of monks who were then operating around single activities. And these companies basically became the mercantile basis of Britain. And after the Spanish destroyed Antwerp in 1637, and London became the primary port of connecting the end of the Silk Road with the beginning of the transatlantic journey to America, and London became fabulously wealthy. Basically, that kickstarted capitalism, where this idea of linear time, which is cumulative, which is exhaustive, and which always demands more. It only goes in one direction. This, of course, produced the Enlightenment and a number of other kind of concepts around industrial capital to do with the idea that every generation, the assumption that every generation is better than the previous one, that they have better technology, that they have better industry, that they have better science and more knowledge, but that they are also more cultured, that they have better cultural and social institutions, that the quality of life is higher, and material conditions of life are better. And this assumption, I think, is only really in the last, I would argue, 10 years or so. I don't think there's been any really serious discussion in mainstream Western society before about 1960 about alternative ideas to this idea, this concept of capitalist time, which Max Weber calls the Protestant work ethic. And it's only really in the last couple of years, with the popularization of the climate crisis, that we've started to see anyone actually talk about concepts of nonlinear circular time in any serious way. So I think we should be very clear about the origins of Western concepts of time, and the fact that they're a fantasy. I mean, the physicist Carlo Rovelli has shown that you can rewrite most of the major calculations for physics without the dimension of time. Unlike gravity or the speed of light, time doesn't appear to be universal constant. It doesn't appear to actually exist in the universe per se. It seems to be a human perception. And therefore, everything we think about time is kind of a product of us being in the world. It's not something which actually is real. Capitalism has attempted to commercialize, to commodify time. And it's important to say something a little bit about what a commodity is. Commodities broadly are, you have kind of resources, you could say, in the natural landscape. For example, if you imagine mushrooms in a forest, all of those mushrooms in a forest in their natural condition are not a commodity. But if I go into the forest and I use my human labor in order to gather them together and then come and sell them at the market, that act of removing the resource from its natural condition in order for it to be used within a human sphere of activity is the production of a commodity. So capitalism only really has two ways of making commodities. The first is it has to keep exploring and discovering new forests, new oil fields, new mountains with minerals. Or the other thing it can do is it can commodify things which previously didn't have an apparent value. The one that I like to use as an example is the post office. In 2011, I think, or 12, the British government sold the Royal Mail. In the 1970s, if you had asked what is the value of the Royal Mail, it had no logic. You couldn't ask this question. It was a public good. It was a public service. The idea that it had a value was nonsensical. But in order for public services to be privatized, they first need to have values attributed to them. And so this idea of applying metrics to things which didn't have metrics on them previously is very key to the way in which everything becomes commodified. And in terms of times commodification, I suppose you could say there's the past, the present, and the future. The commodification of the past is, of course, the commodification of history, which is also an invention. It's the idea that things which are old somehow have some additional value simply because they are old, which I would maybe question. I'm much more concerned today about the commodification of the past is not intrinsically problematic today, I think, but the commodification of the present and the commodification of the future are really where things get pretty difficult today. We seem to be living in a time in which the contemporary has become a primary mechanism for commodification of the individual. I don't think there has been any society in human history in which more people have been demanded to be part of manufacturing what you could call the now. I mean, the idea that so many of us are involved in trends, in consumption of the contemporary, even the idea of the contemporary as a kind of construct of real time is a complete. It's a really weird phenomena, and of course, it's incredibly exhausting because for most of us, we are constantly having to make decisions in the present about things which might affect us in the future. And this gives us a sense of a high level of precariousness, a high level of instability to our daily life, uncertainty, a lot of anxiety. While at the same time, our future, if we think about what I would call the event horizon of capitalism, most capitalist markets are at the maximum, they're buying and selling products about 30 years into the future. So things like pension funds, maybe thinking 30 years into the future. But most capitalists are actually, they have an extremely short horizon on what it is that they can see. It's maybe not more than 1 or 2 years. And so there is really no future beyond that. And of course, if you are operating with this model of exhaustive, cumulative time in which you're just consuming resources infinitely and having to expand and grow infinitely, then short-termism becomes quite a serious ecological problem, as I think we're all aware. But I'm very interested by this event horizon of capitalism because it means that beyond a certain number of years, the future becomes effectively invisible to people working in finance. And that's a great opportunity for architects. How does this practically affect architecture? Because this is very theoretical, what I've been saying. What are the real effects of this? Well, the main effect of a contemporary concept of time is that developers are trying to build buildings with the shortest period in which they are holding debt. What this means is that in Britain and Australia, I don't know about other parts of the world, but I know these two places, more than 99% of all buildings, in the case of the UK, 99.58% of buildings are built to sell. That means that the developer, at the moment that the building is completed, sells the building. So even when you see a kind of rental property, it means that that person has bought the rental property from the developer, either as a company who buys the whole building or as an individual who buys an investment apartment. And this causes a huge problem, because if you're only motivated around maximizing your profit at a single point of sale, all sorts of other factors in construction and ownership become ignored. We are still using some of the most labor-intensive, archaic, and complicated construction technologies. I mean, it's not our fault as architects, but if I were running a startup, a tech startup, and I was creating a new product called concrete, and I said it takes 30 days to set, and it's liquid stone and needs to have all this custom formwork made around it with a huge amount of labor, no one from Silicon Valley would want to invest in concrete. It's, it emits all of this carbon dioxide. It's a terrible material, but we still use it because ultimately the majority of construction models are, we still have mostly men 30 stories off the ground banging bits of wood together with, metal. It's like our construction technologies are generally extremely old fashioned. And that's partly a product of building to sell. The other issue is that the environmental performance of your building is of no concern to the developer. Whether your building lasts 10 years or 40 years or 180 years is not part of their business model. So they don't care. It's not their problem. And this leads to generally poor quality of construction. I am also interested in what happens when you design with time. I mean, I've spoken, I think, even at Newcastle before about the role of that using time as a primary design condition, what impact this can have. And I don't have time today to talk about all of the different mechanisms which are available. Personally, I'm a big fan of bonds, although we'll come to that maybe another time. But just to give one very brief example of what I was saying before about the role and the conception of time being cultural, not being extrinsic or not even actually being intrinsic to capitalism. I would give you just a simple example of a French mortgage versus an Australian mortgage. Australian mortgages have fixed terms, so they're, I think, normally 25 or 30 years, and they have a variable interest rate, which is kind of pegged to the Federal Reserve, but kind of also made up by the different banks themselves. And what that means is that you know that you're going to be paying for 25 years, but you don't actually know how much you're going to pay each month. Whereas in France, the time and money are reversed. So the amount that you pay each month is fixed, but when the rate varies, the period of your mortgage gets longer or shorter. So if the rate goes down, suddenly instead of 25 years, now it's only 24 years. Or if the rate goes up, now it's a 28-year mortgage. And this means that in France, they have historically almost next to zero defaults. Almost nobody gets kicked out of their house. And the reason for this is that you know that you're going to be paying 500 euros every month for an indefinite period of time, which creates a greater level of stability. But in the interest of kind of making good time, I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is space. I think the key thing to say about space is during the Renaissance, the interest and kind of discovery of perspective by Alberti, amongst others, leads, of course, to the idea of the grid, which, of course, influences Cartesian space, the idea that all points in space can be measured in 3 dimensions. And quite, as I was mentioning with time, quite a key point or a precondition for capitalism is the ability to measure things. If you can't measure it, then you don't know if you're making a profit or not. And that's why, I'm always very suspicious of anyone who says they want to apply a metric to something that didn't have a metric on it previously. It's like, what is the consequence of measuring this? Can you measure the love that a parent feels for their child? Can you measure and of course, actually, Facebook now can start to put measurements on that. Can you measure friendship between 2 people? Well, Instagram is trying to do that. Can you measure social influence and social capital? Well, there are people trying to do this. But in terms of space, I think maybe the most important moment to mention is the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, measurements of space were very unequal. So, for example, a French unit of measure equivalent to the meter varied enormously across the terrain of France, as with a measurement of space like a liter. So a liter in Paris before the French Revolution was about 1.1 liters today, but in the south, in Marseille, it was almost 4 liters. Why was that? They didn't have standardized measurements because the state was not very powerful. It couldn't enforce a uniform measurement across the whole country. And it wanted to, because if it could get a universal measure, then it could maximize its tax revenues. The reason why there wasn't a universal system of measures is mainly down to feudal corruption. So feudal laws, there were laws about, for example, how much tax you had to pay each year, and they were often done in measurements. For example, you have to give 1 bag of grain to the local lord as your annual tax. But what the local lord would do is, over time, make the bag bigger and bigger so that you had to pay more and more. And the French, one of the causes of the French Revolution and one of the central slogans of it was one system of measures. They wanted a universal system of measures so that there couldn't be this kind of price inflation by changing the size of bags, the size of the stick used to measure fields, and so extract more. And the consequence of this idea of the universal measure has been to effectively commodify the entire planet. It's also a kind of abstraction of reality, because once you start creating cadastral reality, which is a map-based reality, of course, it comes with many problems of projection to do with us being on a spherical planet. But it also means that, in principle, all parts of the planet can be valued. That because you can draw out an abstract space, let's say 1 acre, on almost any part of the planet, and make a decision to compare it to another acre somewhere else. I don't think it's any coincidence that post-French revolutionary architecture has increasingly moved towards standardized models of space. And this really kind of peaked several centuries later, I think, under someone like Neufert with the Nazis, or Corbusier and his modular, which is all about creating standardized forms of space in order to functionalize and instrumentalize a population, so to reduce their kind of human capacity and turn them into kind of a machinic population motivated around industrial production. There is another kind of aspect which goes along with space, and so what I've just described there, sorry, to be clear, is that the power of the nation state is actually very closely dependent on the idea of the standardization of the measurement of space, and that the exchange of land and property is very key to that. I want to mention just 2 things very quickly, because I'm aware of how little time I have left. But the first thing is, you have what I would call the density paradox, which is in order to maximize your profit, developers are always trying to reduce the size of everything. So they're trying to get the apartments down to an absolute minimum that will be accepted by the law or by the purchaser. They're trying to divide space as much as they can. In the UK, we have a company called Pocket Homes, which I think is an epic ripoff. It ends up being one of the most expensive types of properties per square meter, because of course you're duplicating all of these resources. Whereas I think in the work we've seen earlier today, what's so beautiful about it is that if you are prepared to, let me make it as a general principle. If you're prepared to share your resources, if you're prepared for not every person to insist on having always their own private space, then sharing can be a form of luxury. You can have a higher quality of life if you're prepared to share. Sharing is not a compromise, which in the Anglo world, it's always seen as a compromise of privacy, a compromise of quality of life. And I don't believe that. And I think as architects, we should think very carefully about the way in which we divide space between individuals. But the second thing I just want to talk about is why there is a housing shortage, and why there will always be a housing shortage as long as we have capitalist property relations. It's because in order for this idea of perpetual profit and perpetual growth to continue, you have to have a property market that always goes up. houses always have to get more expensive. So how do you make sure that that's the case? Well, the best way is to make sure that there's a supply shortfall. Because as we know from supply and demand economics, if there's not enough supply, the price goes up. I want to give a very concrete example of this. In the mid-1970s in the UK, the British economy was suffering from many industrial issues, and discontent with this led to the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. And the first thing she had to do was reinvigorate the British economy, this kind of industrial economy. And she wasn't sure how to do it. There were a couple of economists from Chicago who came over to the UK and gave her some advice. And their advice was, you can temporarily stimulate the British economy through debt. You can lend people money and you can get them to buy things, and they will, through that buying stuff, that will stimulate production and consumption. And she said, fine, but nobody has any money. So what am I going to, they don't have any assets that can be guaranteed against this debt. So first, you're asking me to change the whole banking system so that we can start issuing personal debt, which didn't really exist at that time. But what is it going to be secured against? So then the economist said, well, why don't you sell all the houses? Why don't you sell all the social housing? So that's what she did. She sold almost all of the social housing at 40% of its market value. So everyone got a really good deal. They got an instant 60% boost, because by buying it at 40% and it now being valued at 100%, they could now take out credit cards and personal debt for that other 60%. But why we know that this was the definitive decision to create a structural supply shortage was that she also said that any money that comes from the sale of social housing cannot be used to make new social housing. And what this meant is that between 1981 and 2003, there was not a single social housing unit made in Britain. So you have, more than 2 decades where there is not a single social house being made. Sorry, I was just even surprised myself when I said that out loud. So in Australia as well, don't think that a housing shortage it's not a technical problem. You see architects saying like, yeah, we're going to make these mass-produced pods that are going to solve the housing crisis. You cannot solve it with technology. You cannot solve it with finance. The only way you can solve it is through the politics of housing and the politics of land use and land allocation. And the government has no interest in that, because the government is supported by people who vote, who are homeowners. And therefore, if the state was to mass produce huge volumes of affordable housing, it would crash the housing market and everyone would lose their pension because their houses would go down in value. So I just want to be super clear about why we're in the situation that we're in, and that the only way that we will have affordable housing for the majority of people will be if we exit a capitalist and particularly late capitalist model of property relations. So sorry to be a downer about that. But that's kind of how I feel. Anyway, final slide, money. Money's an interesting one. So I think you could probably say that money, how was money invented? There's a couple of stories. There's 2 that I like. The first is ancient Sumeria in about 5000 BC. And the kings of Sumeria had a problem, which was they had armies, but their armies were very, very slow to move. They had huge baggage trains with their wives. All the soldiers had their wives, their children, they had their assistants, they had their animals for food and so on. So they moved very slowly. The Sumerians were trying to think about how to speed up the army. So they came up with the idea of giving leather strips to all the soldiers at the start of the year or the fighting season, and demanding that every peasant gave a certain number of leather strips back to the king at the end of the fighting season. And what this meant was that the army, every time it stopped at night, all of the farmers who lived around where the army had stopped would rush to try and trade whatever they had to get some of these leather strips so that they wouldn't be evicted from their land at the end of the year. And this is also why the military and marketplaces are almost always directly connected to each other historically. But so in that sense, because otherwise it's like, why have money? Why give it away and then ask for it back again in taxes? It makes no sense. Like, if you want all the money, keep all the money. But at least what we can say is that for most of human history, money has been connected to a real good. So it's an abstraction of an actual commodity. It's a piece of paper which actually refers to a piece of gold which is kept in a bank somewhere. But again, after the 1970s, there was a big move to invent what's called fiat currency. And fiat is Latin for, make it so, or by being done, I do it. And so it's currency which is not attached to any underlying commodity. Before that, if you took a $20 bill to the Federal Reserve, it would say on it, I promise to pay the bearer $20 worth of gold. Now, if you take it, you'll actually see that all the notes say, I promise to pay the bearer $20. And it's like, so you give them $20 and they'll just give you a $20 bill back. It's completely self-referential. It has no external reference to it. And this financialization of money has become really problematic. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples as to why. The first is that also in 1979, you can see that this 1974-1980 period is very important. In 1979, Deng Xiaoping, who was head of China at the time, was looking for a way to escape the kind of crushing poverty, which had been a product of the Cultural Revolution under Chairman Mao. And so he had this idea that he would strike a series of production and manufacturing deals with the West. And when we talk about the collapse of industry in the West, it's like, why did it collapse? Well, it collapsed because Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan struck deals, particularly around shipping and postage, actually, with China, which turned China into the industrial beast that it is today. And these contracts dealt with the fact that labor was much cheaper in China, that materials were much cheaper, that there were not the same health and environmental regulations as there were in the West. And so they just outsourced production to China. One of the main problems with this, of course, they assumed that China would become more democratic as it got wealthier, which has not been the case. But the other big assumption that they overlooked was that in China, about the majority of the population save about 40% of their monthly paycheck. So they put it into savings in a bank. In the West, we also had a kind of counter mechanism, which was that banks only need to hold 5% of all the money that they has been deposited. So for every dollar that you put in your bank account, 95 cents of that can be lent out to a company to do something or whatever, right? Now, the problem with this was that we were buying Chinese products and the money was going to China. About half of that money was going into a Chinese bank. And then the Chinese bank was lending that money back to a Western bank who was effectively multiplying it by only keeping 5% of it in the bank and lending the other 95% out as debt. So what in effect was occurring was every time you spent $1 on a Chinese product, you were multiplying that dollar by 20 in terms of debt. And this has led to far, far too much money inside the global economy. There's actually more money than there is products. I mean, there's more money than there is assets. And this hyperaccumulation has led, in combination with rising wealth inequality, to just vast amounts of money that need to find somewhere to go. And there almost aren't enough assets in the world of a high enough value to put this money into it. You add to that something like quantitative easing, which was a post-financial crash strategy of printing new money, and the largest wealth transfer between the state and private enterprise in human history. And you end up with just tons and tons of cash. Almost nobody has any of it, but the small number of people who do have it don't know where to put it. They put it into whatever most expensive I find, art and property mostly. So all of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with in the Australian property markets with foreign buyers. And that's a product pretty much of the fact that in authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, property laws are very weak, which means that if you put money in Russian property at any moment, it could be appropriated by the state. So it's really important to get that money out of the country and into a country which has strong property laws, which is why we have seen the effects that we have. Of course, I mean, yeah, I could go on. I have a couple of other points about money, but I'm just very conscious of time. So I might just conclude by saying, like, what can we do as architects about these types of conditions? I've described more or less a condition in which time, space, and money, there are these profound assumptions that underpin our relationship with them today. And all of those assumptions are preventing us as architects from doing a good job. They're preventing us from I think, pursuing what I would like to believe is the core ethical values of architecture, which is to provide a good quality, affordable, universal standard of living, whether that's in terms of a public sphere, which contributes towards the strength of our democracies, or whether that's a private sphere or a commercial sphere, which of course contribute to our standard of living and contribute to our well-being and enjoyment of life. Nothing about capitalism wants that to occur. It's entirely engineered in the exact opposite. So how do we, in a way, move beyond capitalism? This is maybe where I'll just say a few words about real homes and what it is I've been trying to do. The first thing I realized was that you can't do anything unless you can design your own financial terms. And then I realized that the best way to do this is through ultra long-term finance. So I mentioned before that the event horizon of capitalism is maybe 30 years, maybe 30 years. We're working on a building model which can be guaranteed for 100 years. So we could create, for example, a 100-year mortgage. This requires an incredibly high level of technical execution in the building structure, particularly in the envelope. It's like a kind of passive house plus, I think, is the best way to describe what we're working on, and have been working on for some time with a very large London-based architect as our partners. The idea behind this is, of course, if you divide the cost of a building over 100 years instead of over 20 years, the annual payments become much, much lower. So suddenly you can start to offer rents which are 15, 20% of the market average. We're not going to get there with our first building, but we will get there probably by building 5, which I'm anticipating to be around 2030. Our first building is now approaching the final contracts for financing. The concept is sufficiently resolved for us to do that. And of course, our business model and our investors are in place. So it's quite an exciting time, I think. But the core proposal of Real Homes is basically to say, we want to create housing which is affordable, and we're doing that through by being a company which builds and operates our own housing, because when you operate it, then the environmental impact of the housing becomes part of your business model. So we're building and operating. We're motivated by making that as affordable as possible. We have an alternative ownership mechanism which will turn our company into a cooperative over time, where the residents will eventually take up positions on the board. We're offering people housing security through unlimited rolling contracts. So basically rent control, where you move in and you could be there 20 or 30 years. In fact, we're actually probably going to offer people who will sign up for a 20-year contract a discount on the rent, because you actually save money the longer that someone lives in a building. I won't go into details about why right now. And finally, this question of inclusivity, which is really looking at which demographics are served by housing, and why certain demographics are being excluded from housing, and how we can address that as a company, because we do believe in democracy and we do believe in social equality. So in the end, I'm hoping that Real Homes will be a success, but you'll have to find out more and you can judge it once it's started. I'm going to stop there. I realize it was rather eccentric, and it's more of like a monologue, almost like a podcast rather than a lecture, but hopefully it was useful. and of some interest, and maybe frames also some of the subjects for our next part of the discussion. So yeah, thank you very much.